All right, time for a whole bucket of fun, ladies and gentlemen. We have guests. I love it when we have guests in studio.
It is fun.
It is awesome. All right. That's John King over there, and I'm Peter Christian. And we have Bob Seidenschwartz and, ladies and gentlemen, the super forecasters with us. How are you?
Hello. It's nice to be back.
Good to see you again. Now, the University of Montana Poli-Sci Department, at least part of it, is here with us. And now, John, you had a special treat, right, for one of our guests?
Well, I decided to download the Indian National Anthem because I had never heard it before. So I figured we could play that sometime during the break. We don't have to play it now.
Oh, okay. Well,
we do have Abhishcek Chatterjee in the studio as well, University of Montana professor, who hails, I believe, from India originally. Is that right, Abhishek?
Yeah. It's been a while since I've been back, though.
Yeah,
over 10 years.
I think last time we were talking, you were talking about how you were working on citizenship here.
Yeah. Well, I've been eligible for a while, but I'm so averse to doing anything sort of which involves filling paperwork, etc.
Sure. That's why you became a professor, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're here to talk about things going on in India. Not only that, but here in the States, and kind of a freewheeling discussion with you folks.
That's right, international current events.
It's what you do best.
A bit of a focus on India here, but what we really wanted to kick off with is some chat with Bob Seidenschwartz, a political science history alum from the University of Montana.
All right.
Bob, how has political science played a role in your life? Do you think about politics in your work and life?
Every bloody day. In fact, I sometimes think, here he comes, get away from him, because he's going to talk about...
what's
you mean that's what you think people think of you?
Sometimes, yes.
What's really interesting, we kind of touched on this a little bit yesterday with the fact that the Federal Reserve is meeting today and tomorrow on whether or not to raise interest rates. Mm-hmm. And it's already caused shock waves in European markets, Asian markets, American markets, as to whether or not, with these wild dips and roller coaster rides, and they haven't even done anything yet. Mm-hmm. So Bob, as those discussions begin, will you begin to get hints with minutes that are released, things like that? How's that going to work?
Well, the Feds will, of course, release the minutes of their meeting, and they will clearly state whether they have raised rates or not. And if they don't raise rates, they will give an explanation as to why. Mm-hmm. And as we said yesterday, the question should be is not are they going to raise rates, but why haven't they raised rates for the last 8 to 9 years? And that's really, I think, for me, more the most important question, which is what's happened globally and domestically, economically, that we have kept rates at these levels, because that really is the question and discussion.
Do you see that as a political question mostly or an economic question mostly?
Well, you can't separate the two.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at really what the Fed's mandate is, it is political and it is economic.
That's right.
So I don't make a distinction between the two because they are really, they're hand in glove.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was an economics major and a political science major when I was an undergraduate, so I love to sing that refrain.
Yeah. By the way, she has her fists on her hips like a Superman pose right now, which is appropriate because I want to ask the super forecaster, what's the forecast? Are they going to raise interest rates?
Oh, I don't think they will. Okay. No, I would say 3 to 1 they won't.
And I was saying this yesterday that if you were in Vegas and looking at the betting right now, the over-under is on the side of rates not
John's
being
going to go
raised.
check it out.
Yeah. Right. And again, it goes back to my question. Then if they're not going to raise rates, why?
Right.
What is it about the global economy right now that they're saying we don't want to upset this apple cart?
Well, you're the political science major. How would you answer that question?
But it's an artificial apple cart.
Well, Peter, I've been saying this
the whole thing's made up. It's like sugar taffy. There's nothing there.
Right. You just keep giving the addict, more of the junk, and it's like, when are you going to finally wean them off of this?
Okay, now it's time for our political economy expert, Abhishek, to weigh in.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's the moment you have a government and you have government managing the economy, literally everything you can say is artificial because there is no we've talked about this before, there is no this immaculate conception of the economy which just exists without any sort of legal structure, any state, et cetera. That doesn't happen. So almost necessarily all economic decisions are, if it's artificial, if you say so.
Inherently political.
Inherently political. So I don't make that distinction between what is artificial and what is not artificial. I do make a distinction between what are the forces in favor of certain policies and who are against certain policies and the reasons they tend to give. Sometimes the reasons are not the real reasons for why they want to do things. But
okay, well, can you stop with that just a second? What are the stated reasons that you know of, and what are the real reasons that aren't being discussed very much?
Well, I think part of the reason for I'm going to continue on something that Bob already mentioned, that the global economy features absolutely essentially in their decisions.
Right.
And right now, it would be disastrous for the United States, I think, from the Fed's perspective, to raise interest rates at a time when it's still generally precarious everywhere.
Everything starts recalibrating.
Yeah.
And the recalibration at this point would probably be more to the negative than to the positive. And that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to heal. As I said several times, we've over-leveraged ourselves over the last several decades. And now we're deleveraging. And as you're going down that deleveraging scale, you're trying to do that in the Goldilocks theory where it's just right. But that's extremely difficult to do so.
I wanted to kind of spin off of what you said just a second ago, because I guess my casual analysis, not being a political science major or an economics major, is that America's doing fairly well in the world right now compared to other economies that are recovering. And that a lot of this decision not to raise interest rates is more because of the global economic effects than it is the U.S.'s economic effects. Or I guess I could say I think that it would hurt the economy most likely, but it would hurt other countries far worse than the United States, and that's a major consideration.
But Karen?
Actually, I read the other day that some of the less developed countries have been essentially begging the Fed to go ahead and raise rates because that would at least alleviate the uncertainty that Peter was talking about when it's going to happen. The uncertainty is a really big issue right now. It's going to happen sooner or later, but when is it going to happen? Well, the economy has not recovered to the extent that even the most optimistic expected. And so I'm not sure I would agree that it's mostly for international reasons. The Fed's task is to look at the U.S. economy, and with the Chinese market slowing down so much, it's going to be important to have more of an internal dynamism, which is going to be stoked by, greater investment, easier loan terms, and so forth in the U.S. than by raising interest rates and making money more expensive.
I was going to ask you, for those who are not learned in this issue, what's the big deal about interest rates anyway? I mean, why? So what if they raise it by a quarter of a point or a half a point? Who cares? I mean, how is that going to affect the rest of the world if they bump it up just a little bit?
Well, it's the prime. When the Fed raises the rates, it raises the rates by its rates of lending to the major banks, and so that percolates down the system very, very quickly. And
so it's like voodoo economics.
Yeah. No, I mean
it signals a trend,
and it also signals it's
potentially,
as Bob said, it's actually a couple of things in itself. It has an effect through the actual mechanism of raising the interest rates, and a second effect is the signaling effect Bob was talking about. The Fed is telling the banks or the money market certain things about what it thinks is going on. And of course, the Fed itself has as its members all the major players in the money market. So that has not a small effect.
Well, and I think the easy way to understand it for just a person on the ground, and of course you have to take this at a macro level, millions of people experiencing the same thing, but if your debt was more expensive to you, that would make you less inclined to go get more debt, right? If you had to spend more on that motorcycle, you're going to be less inclined to go buy that motorcycle. And so when that debt hits everybody on a personal level across the nation, a lot of people start, it slows down the money stream a little bit.
Yeah, we don't really think about the cost of money, but that's what this is really about. The cost of money. How much do I have to pay for that home loan? How much am I going to pay every month on my motorcycle? And
people
those
keep
things
looking
make a
at
big
me
difference.
when they say, I don't even have a motorcycle.
I think
Wear
you need
leather
a
every
motorcycle.
day, the chaps and everything. You're such a bad arse.
It's for my skateboard. We're gonna come right back with more of Talk Back in a moment. We'd love to have you join this conversation because really, when it comes right down to it, we're talking about your money. 721-1290 is our. All right, this is where you live, right here. 721-1290. No, don't go there. All right. 721-1290 is our number. 1-800-568-5309. Abhishcek Chatterjee is in with the studio with us, along with Karen Adams from the University of Montana Political Science Department. John King, Bob Seidenschwartz. I'm Peter Christian, and we've got Chris on the line. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Hey, what's on your mind?
Well, I actually have a college background in political science and economics from U of M in the 70s.
Welcome.
Chris, we may have been in the same class. Dr. Lott, Skinner.
Yes, we were. And so, we were horse and buggy days.
Not far from it.
That's what John thinks. Anyway, my question is, I'm just curious how political scientists or economists or, people in the studio currently, how do we, in 2015, what's the definition of political science? What are they told? And what are they told is the free market? I mean, what is the definition of free market? Well, because I just want to say one more thing, sure. Is that in the 70s, there was, across the country, socialism and Marxism were taught alongside free market. It was kind of fashionable then. So anyway, I'm just truly, honestly curious about what these definitions are nowadays.
That's a great question. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the call. Okay, go ahead.
So I'll take the political science part. Abhishek can take the free market part. All right, so I was in school in the 1980s and watched the Soviet Union fall apart. I was thinking last night about watching South Africa with the change of government. So I came along a little later, and at that point, political science became more scientific. The emphasis on trying to think about the political realm as a realm in which things recurrently occur and that can be predicted with certain degrees of probability. Now, obviously, because it's not a natural science, it's much harder to predict. But since you were in school, political science has become more scientific in its methodology. And also, the realm of what we think of the political has expanded so that people are not just studying governments, but they're studying social movements, corporations, international organizations, and so forth. So we think of politics now being, relations of power and influence, trying to achieve collective goals. It's a much broader definition of politics, and we try to study it in general using more scientific tools. Now I'll turn it over to Abhishek for the market part.
Yeah, the free market thing, in this, again, I start in the 60s and 70s. It was as you know better than I do, it was very sort of, it was around the height of the Cold War, there was this contrast made between free market capitalism and socialism, etc. But since then, at least since the 50s, in at least sociology, economic sociology, political science, we've sort of known, we've not said it too loud, that the phrase free market is more of an ideological term. It really doesn't have much meaning in itself. The reason is this: there is no market that can be free. There are always rules and regulations. And what rules there are of transacting, of making exchanges, etc., depends on moral standards of society. In the 18th century, it was fine to transact with a 12-year-old, where you told the 12-year-old, "Hey, I'll pay you if you work in my mine." It's no longer permitted in our society. So, in a sense, the word free market doesn't really mean anything if you think about it. On the other hand, there is a distinction between who own the productive assets in society. Is it what we call private citizens who own it, or is it mostly held by some collective entity called the government? Now, there is a distinction there. And I would make that distinction, to make a distinction between what we call, I mean, these words like socialism and capitalism, etc. I mean, I'm very careful about using these because I think half the people don't know what they're talking about when they use these terms.
Okay, Bob, go ahead.
And does that include the professors at the university who, well, this is an open discussion. Zing. Okay, so here's my...
Wow. Now remember, Bob can't be graded on this appearance.
Right. So here's my question. To your point, when you have students in a university setting, and it's been said over and over again that the majority of professors at most universities are going to be of the more liberal, progressive, whatever we want to define it as. So does that influence come into the classroom when you're having discussions, especially when you're talking about scientific methodology, or is it just simply human behavior is hard to separate?
Hold on there. We got to take a break. So hang on to that answer. We'll be right back. I see that hand. We'll be 721-1290 is our number. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We just posited a question a moment ago, and we want to give our guests a chance to answer that. So, Bob, would you please rephrase?
Yeah, this is just a lot of fun, too, having these guys. And I got to say this. Karen has a wonderful radio voice.
She really does.
You really do.
Really
it's
does.
just very, it just projects. It's very kind of authoritative, but very calm.
And Abhishek sounds brilliant.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
he is brilliant.
So there you go.
And I'm like a bad dream. I just keep coming back.
And me, I push buttons and read. But anyway, so good, Karen.
Well, when I came here for my job interview, we went, the faculty took me out to dinner. It's part of the ritual of coming for your job interview. I came in December of 2004. The mountains were not in sight the whole visit.
Yeah.
I just knew I loved it anyway. And we had a little debate at dinner. I asked the very question Bob just asked, how do things work in the classroom? And, what are your teaching styles? And it was really interesting to see the differences among the faculty, and I think they've persisted. Some faculty, I would say today, most faculty, because we have a younger, more scientifically trained faculty now than we did when I got here, are really thinking about political science as a science, being objective, looking for measures, encouraging debate, pointing out things that are just deeply uncertain. And then others of our faculty are more directive. But I would say that goes a little bit both ways, that some are showing their cards as more liberal and others are showing their cards as more conservative. So I think we have a great balance. What do you think, Abhishek?
Well, I don't know how other people. I kind of have an idea of how you do your classes, but my view is I don't try to tell the students facts because my whole objective is to get them to start thinking systematically about the social world, and that could mean thinking, quote unquote, scientifically, thinking about what evidence is and when evidence is not enough. What is the nature of evidence? How do you frame questions? And what questions make sense in the social world?
It sounds like political philosophy more so than political science.
There is always a philosophical... I mean, I think you can't really do good science if you're not somewhat philosophical.
I don't think you can do much good without philosophy
in
any realm of life.
Yeah.
We only have 30 seconds left, and we're at the top of the hour. So I guess we'll start at the top of the hour talking a little bit about India, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Cool. Oh,
yeah.
That wasn't 30 seconds, John.
Oh,
but that's okay. Allow me just to say we have our guest from the University of Montana Political Science Department joining us here this morning, and we will continue for the next hour. We are going to rock and roll through this whole panoply of issues. It's 721-1290. You like that? Panoply? No extra charge, by the way. 721-1290, 1-800-568-5. I hope I used it correctly. We'll be right back with more of Talkback coming up. We're talking political science, we're talking economics, we're talking all sorts of philosophical things going on here this morning. We'd love to have you join the conversation. All three lines are open, 721-1290. Abhishek Chatterjee joining us, along with Karen Adams from the Poli-Sci Department of UM. Bob Seidenschwartz, of course, here from the Montana World Affairs Council. And our John King has a Facebook question.
That's right. I also have 2 tickets to the Osprey game.
Ooh.
So stay tuned later on. So this is a 1-in-1 game. This will be the final game.
This is the final game.
And our Osprey versus Idaho Falls.
The Chuckers.
Leave It to Beavers or something like that.
No, it's the Chuckers.
Anyway,
come on.
Watch the Missoula team kick their butts tonight. But we'll give these tickets away later today. So stay tuned for that.
Wow.
I used to live in Idaho Falls and have very little love for that city. Sorry, guys. I do have a question. This one's for Abhishek from earlier when we were talking about either command and control and capitalistic or versus controlled economies. This one's from Katie. She says, is it your position that a top-down economy with a government setting the goals and objectives works better than an entrepreneurial economy? And if so, would you give some examples of successful economies that are structured that way?
Well, I have a view about that, which is that it's very hard to make top-down plans when complex systems like societies are involved. This argument was first made by one Ludwig von Mises in the 19th century, and he was right about this. You can
totally digging your vibe right now, man.
You can disagree with von Mises on lots of things, and I do, but about this whole informational equation where, how is information percolated in a complex society? I mean, who gets to do people at top have enough information to make effective decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So for those reasons, I think, generally speaking, to take an extreme example, a complete command economy, I would have a very hard time sort of imagining it working smoothly over a long period of time, a complete command economy. But of course, in reality, as of today, all economies are run with a mixture of some kind of command and decentralized planning and things like that.
So would you, in your view, consider China as an example today of a command economy?
I would say that it's more command than other economies. But if you think about the United States, which we all think exemplifies a non-command economy, if you think about who are the major actors whose decisions actually make a difference in the economy, it's a very small number of people. It's a very small number of even private actors. We're talking about small number of corporations that make investment decisions.
You're not talking about like the Illuminati, are you?
Oh, no. I barely know who the Illuminati
I just want to throw that out there because when you say small number, I know some of our audience goes, I know it. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
Not that. I mean, like, they don't really consciously do this, but it's just because of their size, because of the effect they have, their decisions matter a great deal. And so it's not central planning, but it's, human beings plan.
So here's a question for both you and Karen. When we talk about this, we tend to use structural types of descriptions. And one of my observations is human behavior is, like we said earlier, it's like a dog's breakfast. It's all over the place. And when you have 1 billion people in China, India, 360 million, 350 in the United States, there's a lot of little economies that are doing their own thing that aren't always connected to this centralized type of entity. So when it comes to human behavior, how much of that comes into political science discussion? And I know from an economics and investment standpoint, not enough attention has been spent and paid to that very type of issue.
Right. I think, in my view, you have to look at both of them. You have to look at what is the structure of the system, and then you have to look at what are people actually doing. And a great example of that was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was probably the most centralized economy in the history of the world. And yet, at the same time, at the peak of that centralization, individuals were engaged in informal markets, meaning unregulated, illegal markets, growing things in their backyard illegally, trading them, bartering, and that was really important in sustaining the human security of people in the Soviet Union. So if we just looked at the formal system, we would think it was very centralized, but even in that system, and even more in the Chinese system, there is still, private transaction, room for private transactions, and those things are important in providing a cushion for the whole system.
Real quick, before we pivot to India, I want to get a philosophical question answered for me. So you had an issue earlier with the descriptor of capitalism or socialism being used And so for me and the rest of your students that are here on the air with you right now, what do you think is a good spectrum to discuss market economies with? Would you say something like markets that are more controlled by a federal government or less controlled by a federal government, or where the choices are made more by the individual than by a political organization?
It depends on what you mean by control, John, because, sometimes it's funny to think about, but sometimes you need really more rules and more control if you're going to make a market more competitive, sometimes. And this has been observed throughout history. In the medieval times, the kings wanted to exert more control over markets, because markets meaning these fairs and markets, partially because they were afraid that a few big sellers would sort of become monopolistic, and that would cut into the king's priorities and so on and so forth. So it's not about how much control even. I think it's a continuum. You're correct. It cannot be like this or that. It's always a continuum. And I think I'll go back to what Bob said. Because human behavior, I don't want to use complex because, in a sense, the word complex means I don't know what it is. But let me just put it this way. Human behavior is such that our sort of concepts, solid concepts, cannot really capture the whole sort of...
Sounds kind of wishy-washy to me. Tell me what the continuum is.
Okay, here.
What is the continuum?
I'll do it. I'll do it. So in my Introduction to International Relations class, when we work on political economy, I talk about the difference between theory and practice. You can imagine a totally free market. You can imagine a totally controlled market. But reality is in between those things. So it's helpful to have the thought experiment of the extremes. But as Abhishcek and Bob and we have all been discussing, no country really works on the extreme.
Okay, we're going to come right back. 721-1290 is our number. We're going to start talking about what's going on in India, and because we have an expert right here to mine all the things that he knows, and that's a lot. So 721-1290 is our number. We'll be right back. 721-1290 is our number. This is Talkback, and that's John King. I'm Peter Christian, Abhishcek Chatterjee, and Karen Adams both joining us, and John is chomping at the bit.
So we really wanted to talk about India a little bit today, and so I think now's a good time to kind of pivot over to India. And one of the things that I have a bunch of questions about India. The first question I do want to get into is, why is India one country? When we think about India, how big it is, there are 300-some million people in the United States. In India, I think it's something like 1 billion, 3 million, 300 million, 1.2 billion.
Kind of, yeah.
So it's the size of the United States, but at a billion, which is a huge number.
It's one-third the size.
Well, if you take out Alaska, it's slightly more than one-third. It becomes.
You don't take Alaska. We made a hell of a deal to get Alaska, my friend. Why don't you just take out Mumbai?
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Do I have to go back in that back seat and separate you two? What's the deal? Don't make me come back there.
So back to that question. Why is India one country?
Well, it's a long story, John. And let me begin from the beginning. To be serious, the subcontinent is it's a geographic feature. So India was created when part of sort of what was in South America, all the continents were congregated there. Part of it broke off and collided into Asia, right? That's why you have the Himalayas, the mountain range, which cleanly separates the subcontinent, that's why it's called the subcontinent, from the rest of Asia, from China. So it forms a natural geographic feature. Now, how does that affect politics and history? This is how. Every king, India has a very long sort of continuous history.
It's a deeper history than most of the world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, ancient civilizations.
Very ancient. It goes back to the 5th century BC. Even before that, there were like huge towns and cities. That area has always been one of the most populous regions in the world, historically, over the last 5,000-6,000 years. always. And so every kingdom that emerged there that we know of, that we have some documentation of, the ambition of the ruler was always to rule over all of that subcontinent because it's a natural geographic feature. And the people on the other side of the mountains, Chinese visitors who came to university in India to study. India also had the oldest international university in the world. It was called Nalanda. It was on the eastern part of India where people from all over the world, this is, set up by the Buddhists. They came to study. So Chinese scholars, Southeast Asian scholars, some people from the Middle East, they would come long distances to study in that university. And they taught medicine, science, what was called philosophy, and so on and so forth. So, part of the reason is that everybody who came to India, they referred to India as one unit. And this goes back 5,000-6,000 years. They said there are lots of kingdoms, there are lots of peoples live there, but those are, they live on that side of the mountain, the same and the land stretches to the sea, etc.
So it's us and them.
Well, this is the outsiders saying they're one people.
Yeah.
But inside India, I think last time we spoke, you had mentioned how there's lots of different dialects.
Yeah.
They call
languages.
or languages. They call you Abhishcek here. They call you Abhishek here. Yeah. Even inside of India, right? So when I think of that, I think of this is a huge difficulty to overcome. And if you look at like South Africa, for example, you don't see this consolidation of power simply because they're locked into regions where there isn't desert and there's kings that want to own everything. You see more strife and bloodshed and separation in these regions. So why didn't that play out the same way in India?
Well, that's a very good question. So let me rephrase your question a little bit just to sort of be clear to myself, really. So you're saying if you have a big region with so much separation, why isn't there sort of internecine sort of warfare all the time, like what happened in Europe, right?
Europe, or even like the subcontinent in Africa, I think was a connection I was making. You've got a geographic area, it's kind of locked in pretty well, and you've got kings that want to own everything, and you've got diverse language groups, and for some reason India is one country and South Africa isn't, and Europe isn't.
Well, that's. I think the most immediate reason why India is one country is that the British were the last colonialists who had the same ambitions developed the same ambition over time as had several big kings and emperors in India. They basically took over from the Mughals who ruled all of the subcontinent too. Except for the southernmost part.
Please explain that term so our audience understand who they are and what that connection is. Because one of the issues we're having is India is not India as it exists today 100 or 500 years ago.
Okay, I hate to do this. Okay. I'm so sorry. I've got to insert a spot break here, so we'll take a breath. Okay. Come back and we'll discuss Mughals.
Cool.
Are you talking Moguls or Mughals?
Well, Moguls, the word Moguls comes from the Mughals.
If you bury a Mughal in the snow, it becomes a Mogul.
Or you put your ski.
Okay, I'm just going to go home and go to bed now. Well, we'll be right back. Stay with us. And now we return, ladies and gentlemen, to a brief history of India, and this is really fascinating. So I'm so sorry I had to interrupt there, but we need to go ahead. Let's pick up where we left off. The Mughals.
Yeah, we were talking about the Mughals. You were explaining that for Bob.
Yeah. So the Mughals were this was the empire that fell apart just as the British were coming into India. At its height, it ruled from modern-day Afghanistan down to, except for the southernmost parts of India, it ruled over all of the subcontinent. Now, where do the Mughals come from? Well, these are Turco-Persian warriors who came to India from the northwest, entered through Afghanistan further back. From Central Asia, essentially from Central Asia. At the time of their arrival, there were some sultanates ruling over India. I'm talking about the 15th century, 14-something. And they had these big cannons.
Are these the people we would call the Aryans?
No. The Aryans, that's like 6,000, 7,000,
okay.
way before, yeah. I'm talking, about 13th, 14th century. So I can go back farther, but I don't want to. But so when
you'll be getting into my territory.
Yeah.
In the beginning.
Yeah. And so they came over from the northwestern part of India when there were small sultanates. So basically Muslim rulers ruling over northern India. They had cannons. They had sophisticated cannons that had just been used to great effect. And so they defeated the Delhi Sultanate, and they settled down in Delhi. The first emperor, whose name was Babur. And they, over the next 200 years, they expanded, and they became Indians, essentially. And that's actually the case with India.
Now, these conquering groups, the Mughals, were they pushed out of Asia by the Mongols? To add another almost similar sounding word to the group, did the Mongols push the Mughals into northern India?
I think I don't think they were pushed by the Mongols. I think there was some admixture between the what you call the Mongols and the Mughals and so on. Okay. So they're like I said, they're Turco-Persian. They were mostly Sunni Muslim, but they spoke Persian, and they came from Central Asia. And so they settled down. They intermarried, became Indians essentially, or what we would today call Indians. And like I said, at their height, emperor at the height. So this was the last big emperor was Aurangzeb, which was 18th century, I think. 18th century, about the 18th century. And they ruled a huge portion of the subcontinent. And they had a pretty, they had a quasi-centralized government. They had a pretty, at least by the 18th century, pretty regularized sort of bureaucracy for collecting revenue.
And was New Delhi the center? Or
New Delhi, Agra or New Delhi. So Agra is where the Taj Mahal is. So the Taj Mahal was built by Shah Jahan, who was one of the Mughal emperors.
You know, Abhishek, I've heard from some political economy authors I've read that when the British arrived, they were amazed at the technical proficiency of the Indians, and in fact learned some of what we would consider to be mass production techniques from the Indians as they conquered them.
Well, in the 17th century, I mean, the British, what happened with the British is a very interesting story. But in the 17th century, India and China together accounted for about, the best estimates are over 50% of world GDP. India accounting for about 22 to 25%. So this was one of the largest manufacturing centers in the world, where cloth, the Indian cloth, muslin, and so on, and other manufactured items were really prized in Europe. I mean, that's why the East India Company came to India. And they came in, actually, the first East India ships landed, East India Company ships landed in 1612 or 1613. So they actually traded for about 120, 30 years before the Mughal Empire started disintegrating. And they saw an opportunity to take over certain areas, and they expanded from there. But before that, it was, if you read some of the documents, there was no sense of empire that they'd come to. They were trading on equal basis with Indian trade. In fact, there were these Indian merchants who they would write about that each one of them controlled more ships than the entire East India Company.
So this wasn't a case of a military invasion,
no,
per
not
se,
at all.
where you took over that country
not
and
at
then
all.
established your,
couldn't be farthest from that.
Right,
Yeah.
and I don't think a lot of people, I think in their minds, if you would ask the average person, how did this happen? My thought is they think it was probably some type of military invasion.
No, they
it was an
couldn't have.
economic invasion.
Yeah. It wasn't even an invasion at first. So
Right.
Here's the thing about the Mughals, right? And this is the argument I make in something I'm writing. That one of the problems, I think, if you compare the Mughal system with what was emerging in Europe in the 17th and 18th century, was that the Mughals did not pay that much attention to trade at all. They left the merchants be. So basically, as long as the merchants could every year collect some taxes and convey it to the king didn't give a damn about, or didn't care at all about what was going on in the ports. The reason being that they were sort of quintessentially a land power, and most of their revenues came from land. So they actually paid really close attention to cultivation and big landowners, and they wanted the big landlords to be on their side because these were kind of agents of the king who were collecting land revenues. Because land revenues were such a huge portion of government revenue, the kings really didn't pay much attention to trade, commerce. It was a smaller portion of the revenue.
So there wasn't any interference then.
There was very little. In fact, the Mughal rulers were really, really reluctant to meddle in the affairs of the merchants. They always considered it bad to have to do so.
Okay, we're going to take another break. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm just sitting here. I'd like to just throw the commercials out and just listen for the next 20 or 30 minutes. We're going to come right back after this quick timeout. If you have a question or a comment, I know you're listening just like I am. 721-1290 is our number. What do you think, John? Should we give?
You know what? I think it's a good time to give away some tickets.
I think so too.
Yeah, and so the first person to call 721-1290 and spell the word. No, I'm just joking.
Moogle.
We just want the first caller. They're going to win tickets to tonight's Osprey game.
Okay. Again, this is the championship game. This is it, folks. So the Osprey and the Idaho Falls Chuckers. We'll be right back. Thanks for joining us here on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We're kind of in the middle of if you will, a little classroom on the radio here, talking with Abhishcek Chatterjee and Karen Adams from the Poli-Sci Department at the University of Montana. Go ahead, John.
Well, I hesitate to do this, but I kind of want to flash forward a little bit. Maybe we can work our way from where we are in history to today. But the question I have for you is one that actually I asked myself this morning as I was trying to do research on India. Why doesn't anyone care about India? When I go onto sites like Real Clear Politics and their world section, I don't see India in any of. I have to dig to find India. And yet it's a populace almost the size of China. It's a big mover and shaker in the world, one would think, with simply by having a giant populace of that size. It just seems that even in the past, it's been relatively peaceful compared to many of the other areas in the world. And despite its size, just seems to be largely ignored and misunderstood.
I want to have Karen Abhishcek kind of come into this because, first of all, India is going to be one of the principal players in the 21st century, economically and politically, by population, by job creation. Youthful population exists within the country, which has some potentially tremendous advantages to it going forward, and it is central in terms of China, Middle East, and the U.S. in terms of its strategic importance being in the subcontinent. So one of the implications is there's not enough people who are writers that are following India, from my perspective. So I think this dynamic is changing, and I'll let you two kind of expand upon that.
Well, I think part of the answer is what you just said. Is it's just seems too complicated to most people. The society and when I tell you that there are 25 official languages, at least actually right now it's up to 30, and languages as different as Swedish is from French or Swedish is from Italian. So so if you cross state lines, if you didn't speak the language of the state, you suddenly couldn't read any signs.
So even inside this, I go to Switzerland, pretty much everyone's trilingual. At least in my experiences.
Yeah.
Is that the same? Like when you go to India, everyone knows 2 or 3 languages?
Yes, at least 2 or 3 languages. You kind of have to, because otherwise you couldn't probably communicate with most people. In fact, Hindi is the national language. It's not spoken by most Indians. There was a funny story in the 1990s that a guy from the South became the Prime Minister of India, and he didn't write or speak Hindi. So they had to write Hindi in English to him so that he could deliver a speech in Hindi, which sounded completely ridiculous because he couldn't...
Sounded like Hillary reading a teleprompter. I tell you, I believe in America.
I ain't no ways tired.
Oh, man.
Don't give these guys this opening. Haven't you learned by now?
All right, back
to India.
So It sounds all too complicated to people. I think people who there are relatively few people even in political science who study India, because if you are, it's the same with China, because if you are sort of an India specialist, it takes a long time to build some kind of understanding, and that's one of the reasons why people don't talk about it a lot. I don't know what Karen thinks about this. But.
Yeah, I've just sitting here thinking about all the times we've been in here and we've said, Abhishcek, we should really talk about India at the end of every show. Everybody has a million questions, but then we get in here and the Fed is going to, we start off with the Fed and we talk a lot about China, and it's kind of like India isn't really a big problem, really, for the world right now, right?
Is that part? It's not a pebble in anyone's shoe?
Sure. I mean, you know how news works, right? What's the latest crisis?
Yeah.
And India isn't really presenting them. Plus, India is a democracy, and so there's a tendency in Western countries to see it as an easier partner and as less of a threat than other countries like Russia or China.
And they've historically had a non-alignment.
That's right.
Public
during the
national
Cold War.
policy.
During the Cold War, India was non-aligned with either the U.S. or the Soviet Union. But I do want to go back to something Bob said, and that is that over the long term, India will surpass China in terms of the size of the economy. China will surpass the U.S. in terms of GDP in around 2020, and India is projected to surpass China around 2050. Now, those are long, especially the 2050 is a long time from now, but there are good reasons to expect that will be true, especially the younger average age of the Indian population.
So it's simply is it a question of manpower or people power? Is that why you're making that projection, or people are? The overcoming by GDP? Is it because of the number of the populace, or is there some other elements that lead to that?
So these models are really complicated. They project current trends of GDP growth and industrialization, education levels, and so forth. So the UN Statistical Agency, Morgan Stanley, all these forecasting companies basically are making projections based on a lot of different factors, and most of them agree that around 2050, the sheer size of the Indian economy will be larger.
Karen, we have to go to a break, so when we come back, I want to continue on this path because there's some fascinating insights in terms of what are the challenges that India faces today, and I'll leave you with this teaser. 400 million people today do not have access to electricity in India. That's larger than the entire population of the U.S. So when we come back.
Okay, stay with us. Again, we have all three lines open, 721-1290, if you want to get into the conversation. This is, ordinarily you'd have to pay a lot of tuition to be able to sit in on something like this. So this is free for today, and we'd love to have you take advantage of it. And we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We're just thrilled to have you along this morning. I know you're enjoying all this conversation as much as I am. John King's with us. We've got Bob Seidenschwartz with the Montana World Affairs Council, Karen Adams, and Abhishcek Chatterjee, who are with the University of Montana Political Science Department. Okay, where were we before I so rudely interrupted, Bob?
Just I want Karen and Abhishcek to kind of address what are some of the challenges that India faces. It's a 21st century country. It will continue, as Karen pointed out, to move in surpassing China, the U.S., and GDP. But what does that really mean? So please.
Yeah, that's a very good question because the problems are huge, developmental problems and so on. You should realize that between 1757, when the British first took over a part of India, to about 1947, India's GDP did not change at all. And part of the reason was when the rest of the world was growing pretty fast due to colonial policies, due to the decimation of local industry, etc., there was not much growth. Plus, there were these periodic famines where millions of people would die, etc., etc. So by the time 1947 comes around, it's a very, very poor country. It's one of the poorest countries in the world in 1947 with a huge population. So you can imagine the challenges, developmental challenges facing the first independent government were huge. Nobody expected India to survive another 10 years, like as a democratic state. Nobody did.
Has its rise been impressive? Has democracy done for India what it did for South Korea?
Well, I don't think democracy did much to South Korea.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Korean War is what helped South Korea, and all
Sure.
this U.S. spending in South Korea after the Korean War.
Well, so the developmental challenges are huge. Like Bob said, 1.2 billion people. I'll give you some figures to give you a sense of the problem. A recent, the government of India came out with the recent census they did. It's not a official. It's not like the yearly census they do. It's called a caste and social inequality census or something like that. And they found that only about 10% of the population is salaried, meaning they work for a salary and get paid regularly. Most people, about 60, most households live in villages. So out of 248 million households, that's households, 248 to 250 million households, close to 188, 190 live in what are designated as rural areas. Of course, the definition is slightly different because it's a very populous country.
So are they living on subsistence farming?
Yes, most of them either subsistence farming or they're landless laborers. And so you can imagine the challenges of moving that kind of population to a state where, say, most people are salaried or get a regular paycheck, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just mind-boggling to actually even encounter the various problems in India. Of course, there's lots of social inequality. There are lots of very rich people, millionaires and billionaires and so on. They're a very small percentage of the population. But that's true. I mean, since the 1990s, especially, the number of people who are sort of very rich has gone up. In fact, since the 1990s, there was this liberalization in the 1990s, which basically meant that a lot of controls were done away with. India was it was traditionally a quasi-controlled economy. So the state owned mining enterprises, the state owned electricity, and state owned certain things. But of course, at the same time, it also had one of the largest private sectors of small businesses, small entrepreneurs trying to make do, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all these extremes in the same country. So it's very hard to that's why mean figures do not really convey what we are talking about here.
One thing that to me I wanted to ask you about, and Bob has brought this up before, especially in China and in developing countries, where people begin to become urbanized. They want internet access. They want transportation. They want infrastructure. They want all the things that they see in the West because of the communication through the internet. Gosh, they have that over there. Why can't we have that here? And as that happens, one of the things Bob has always said is energy becomes the key to everything. Is that right, Bob? Or
I continue until proven otherwise. Say yes. Yeah. You cannot urbanize without having to dramatically increase your energy input and output. And the world is moving from and will be more urban across the entire spectrum of countries.
So in India, can you just spend a minute and talk about the power sources in India? Where does it come from? Is it wind? Is it hydro? Well, what is it?
A lot of coal.
Yes, lots of coal and a lot of imported energy. That's one of the reasons that the Iran deal was very important for India, because they always wanted to have Iran as a source of energy where they could buy energy. So India is a net importer of its energy needs. But oil from Iran, some from the Gulf states and so on. But the plan is, and there are some plans afoot, as Sherlock Holmes would have said. There are some plans for alternative energy like solar and wind power and so on. So there are all these entrepreneurs trying to set up.
Okay, we're going to take a 1 minute time out, and then Karen's going to make a comment, and then we'll have 8 minutes left of the program. So I hope you're taking notes, because there will be a test at the end. 721-1290 is our number. Ladies and gentlemen, the Indian national anthem, right there. We've been talking about India. Why not? All right. So, Karen, you had a comment you wanted to make.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that at the end of the month, all of the heads of state will be coming to New York to prepare for the opening of the session of the UN. And before then, Prime Minister Modi will be in the U.S. talking about energy. So there'll be a big U.S.-India energy summit. These are really important issues between the U.S. and India, as well as within India.
Right.
Because we don't want to lose that connection, obviously, the United States, right?
Well, you know, you've heard me talk about the rise of China before. To me, what's interesting watching in U.S. foreign policy is as the Chinese power rises, we're spending more time cultivating the India relationship, which is exactly what you would expect from, you know, balance of power politics, basically. India isn't yet of the status that China is, but it would be sort of nice if everybody would think that, so that maybe China wouldn't be too aggressive.
We've made some progress diplomatically in terms of moving our relations to a better place. There's still a lot of work, and as was pointed out, India historically has been a non-aligned nation.
Right.
And a quick comment on the energy side. For a country as large as India, they're not blessed with the natural resources, especially on the extraction side. Now, there is a potential for some substantial natural gas finds that are being looked and developed as we speak. But coal, nuclear energy is going to become a bigger part of the mix. Of course, they're looking at solar. But remember, there's got to be capital investment. And there's got to be the ability to provide infrastructure build-out, which, to your point, there's major challenges.
Yeah, infrastructure is another problem in India. It's a huge problem. It's very hard to quickly build good infrastructure in India because of lots of legal barriers. It's very hard to take away land in India from somebody. There's some land that no private owner can even own in certain areas. It has to do with the federal system and concessions made to certain states, concessions made to certain groups about how their interests would be protected under the federal constitution, etc.
So real quick, just so I understand, is it because of the private property rights of the individuals that the land can't be used, or because of it's like federal forest land or federal religious land or something like that?
It's both, actually. It's very hard to again, it's actually both, because there are lots of poorer people occupying small areas of land over which they have some kind of legal right, and it's very hard to. In China, you can actually move people very quickly. In India, that would be very, very difficult. In fact,
is there any possibility of a concept like eminent domain in India?
It's the legal system as when it comes to taking over land is exceedingly complicated. The government, I mean, even beyond the legal system, what normally ends up happening is you have these huge protest movements coming up immediately, and then, of course, no politician wants to touch land acquisition again.
Is their legal system somewhat derived from English common law, or is it completely different?
No, it is somewhat derived from English common law. In fact, it's just ridiculous how many old 19th century or 18th, sometimes late 18th century laws, English laws are still in the books. Really? Yeah, the law against sodomy, for example, dates back to a Victorian era law in the 1860s or 70s, when the Victorians thought that the Indians were too lecherous, because for them they were in many ways. For Victorians, they were. So that law still exists in the books. So there are all these. If you're a lawyer and you want to go through the law books in India, you'll find some curiosities, I'm sure. But yes, English common law.
One last question. One of the things that I've been reading recently is about the differences between China and India. And I was struck by something that I read, kind of contrasting the giant megacities of China with the absence of them in India. Obviously, there's a lot of people, similar numbers of people kind of in these two countries, and yet the people in India behave differently. They live, according to this article that I read, and I'm just assuming it's true, about half of their life out in the rural part of the country, and they drive in or ride into town on cheap transit to go work in the city, and then they come back, and they kind of have feet in both worlds. And I guess I wanted to ask you, is it true, and what does it mean for the future of India?
Well, It is. It's substantially true that cities in India are not really planned. There are a couple. There's one called Chandigarh, which is the capital of Indian Punjab, which was planned. But generally, cities are not planned because part of the reason is there is this. Unlike China, there is no internal passport. Any Indian can travel anywhere they want to. In China, you can't enter Beijing without an internal passport. And in India, there's free movement, according to the constitution, obviously. You have these huge in-migration, sometimes seasonal, sometimes permanent, and then slums grow because, space is at a premium. And after a while, the people who live in slums vote, and politicians rely on them for the vote, so those slums become permanent.
In Mumbai right now, they want to build a rail system.
Yeah.
But there's about a mile or two of which there's a couple of million people living in abject poverty. They don't want to be moved. Yeah. And the battle, which they need this rail system, is just causing all sorts of havoc there. But look, we've got about a minute or two. What I'm hearing here today, too, is this is why you immerse yourself in issues like this, because to understand the world, the complexity, has direct impact on us here.
Karen, she's glowing right
now.
Aren't you glad you were a poli-sci econ major? So I would say that what we're talking about here really exemplifies the big question that that we have to ask about the future international system, which is who would we put our money on at this point to be the dog in the race for the long way? Is it going to be India, which has a lot of slowness because of its democracy, or is it going to be China, which can move faster? There are ways to handicap it either way. China can move faster. It can solve big problems quickly, but it may not be able to solve them in ways that are sustainable politically. And on the other hand, India, looks like a pretty messy place a lot of the time. But
you're the forecaster. Who you putting your money on over the next 30 years?
We're out of time.
We'll have to bring it back to answer that question.
Wop, wop, wop. Tomorrow we'll be talking with Seaford and Rhodes, right? And you guys have a great day, everybody, and we will talk to you tomorrow.